Is social mobility in our society a lie?
Yes. Let me put it that way. I mean, we're told that it's all hard work, or it's mostly hard work. But when you look at what really defines life chances, when you look at the factors that matter the most, the number one factor that defines 2/3 of where you will end up in the income spectrum is the country you're born in. We forget that factor altogether. And then even when you take that out, it's the wealth of your family, it's the school you go to, it's your race and class, all of those things come in. So one of the things I say in the book is the difference even with myself and, say, David Cameron and Boris Johnson. So I was born to a car mechanic in East London. And when you look at the difference in paths, just as an illustration, the ability for me to do something similar, like go to Oxford, become an MP, was 1,000 times less likely than David Cameron and Boris Johnson. And for a lot of us, once you look at that gap, it's not that, okay, you can work hard and you can make it, but why should anyone work 1,000 times harder to do exactly the same job? And so, the idea that it's all on you, that it's all about your hard work and not about societal factors around you is just not true.
And what does real freedom look like to you?
True democracy, basically, where we all, as individuals, have the power to shape what goes on in our lives, but also as collectives, as communities, as workplaces, as citizens, we have the power to work together to shape how we're governed, to basically govern ourselves. And it sounds kind of airy-fairy and like, how's that going to work in practice? But in the book, I look at all these examples of what's happened when people have basically come together and said, we're going to take charge of this community, we're going to take charge of this workplace. I study capitalism from a Marxist perspective, which sounds very scary. It sounds kind of like a bit of a dirty word today. And I argue that the system of production that we have in capitalism, where some people own all the stuff and everyone else has to work, creates a particular type of political system, one based on basically hierarchy and domination, where the average person is basically viewed as unable to make important decisions about their lives, in which politicians say, we can't have real democracy because the masses will just abuse it, where CEOs say workers can't possibly be given control over production. They have to be managed very carefully by often by AI and these very centralized processes. And for me, the only way to push back against this kind of power is to demand real democracy, is not just to hope that we can vote for different politicians or have different corporate executives and they'll somehow start making different decisions. It's actually to say, for as long as these people are able to monopolize power and wealth in this economy, they will continue to make decisions that benefit them.
Did you say to Jacob Rees-Mogg, you must be so gutted, all that money your parents spent on your education, you've ended up working alongside a brickie from Kirby.
What did he respond?
Jacob was really weird, because at that time he wasn't as cynical and as bitter and twisted, although he was certainly that person, but he didn't display it in the same way. He used to be quite sort of self-deprecating, and he'd take it a bit, Now, of course, I see a very different character, and it's a shame, really. The old one was much better.
When you entered into politics, did it feel like you were joining a club of Etonians?
No, not at all. I am that, obviously, and there's a bit of that going on. But no, politics isn't like that. I think there are fewer privately school-educated people in politics than there ever have been. Many, many of my colleagues had left school at 15 or 16. Many non-graduates, many people who'd grown up in single-parent families, many people who'd been local councillors in Northern England had barely been to London before. The question to flip around to the public is, there's a problem with me, right? I'm a privileged person. I've spent my whole life with huge privilege and experience and education and chances to study Chinese and work in Asia. I'm not normal. But who do you actually want negotiating with the Chinese government?
Not all countries are like kind of Sweden and Norway and things. But given in many ways we can see that works, why is it that the UK is not more like that? Is there just not the will? Is there not the desire?
Yeah, I do think it comes down to political will. I mean, I work with a lot of governments around the world, or I have been the last couple of years, governments where they are trying to do the right thing or trying to look at these issues like Spain and Costa Rica and various other countries around the world. And one thing I've noticed, the difference in the leadership is there's this real sense of purpose and vision to do something about the gap between the very rich and the rest of us. Once you've got that in mind, once you've got a clear goal in mind that you actually want to deliver, and you are willing, and this is the key thing, you're willing to say there needs to be some type of sacrifices at the very top, where there can be more taxes, where there can be more efforts to address privilege, then you can make things happen. The problem we have in this country is that for the most part, it's run by the rich, for the rich. And you can see that in various ways in the press kind of every day. And we saw it very strongly with the corruption issues, quite frankly, around PPE contracts. And it's certainly, having had this international experience of working with different governments, I've been really struck by just the inertia at the top here and how that's done on purpose, just to make sure that the wealth is kept there.
I wanted to kind of take apart this idea that capitalism means free markets and democracy. And what I show in the book is that actually real capitalist systems, the kind of economies in which we live today, markets aren't very free. Democracy doesn't work very well. And instead of having this really clear separation between private institutions and the government, you have big corporations and states basically working together to make sure that the people at the top kind of continue to be able to extract wealth from everyone else and kind of wield political power with very little resistance. What you see is this kind of fusion of public and private power in service of just augmenting the wealth and power of those at the top. And it just kind of undermines this idea that capitalism is the same as democracy and free markets, and shows that we live in these deeply hierarchical societies in which, as I said, this kind of fusion of corporate and public power is used to really just make the average person feel disempowered.
It should be that the position of local government should be constitutionally protected, that they are given enough money to actually do the job that they're being asked to do. But they're not, because we live in this sort of kind of country where it's all can be fudged and, it all can be negotiated. But that just means everyone has to go on bended knee to Whitehall, please, can we have some more? That's the effect of not having a written constitution. You have a country that the power is just completely centred in one place and everyone else has to go and beg and plead for everything. So you need rules to protect people, places, critical functions that bodies have. And I don't think we should be allowing this sort of kind of really unwritten sort of situation to proceed, because this is what's left us with this really unequal country. We are one of the most unequal countries in the world. And how much longer are we going to put up with that?
And Andy, how did you feel when the HS2 project, the northern part of it, was scrapped?
It's just, I've had my kind of differences with Westminster over the years, over Tier 3 and Hillsborough and other things, but the way it was done, it was more the way it was done was just almost like it was beyond belief, really, wasn't it? That they were in our city for their conference and they let this rumour mill go out of control for weeks that they were going to scrap it. We were saying, please, will you meet us? Can we at least just have a conversation? Given that, you came to our city in 2014, George Osborne, and said HS2, HS3, Northern Powerhouse. Oh, yeah. They came and promised it. And then we were left 10 years later pleading for a meeting to find out what they were actually going to do and whether we could. Ignored it all and then stood up in the conference in Manchester and just canned something that they'd promised us 10 years before. It was unbelievable. What other country in the world would the mass ranks of the government be assembled in a particular city and they would refuse to speak to the leader of the city council, the elected mayor? That, if you want the kind of audacity of Westminster in sort of one example, surely that's the most blatant.
And given the people in power hold the power, how do you stay optimistic about really changing things?
One of my favourite democratic socialist politicians is Tony Benn. Some of you might be familiar with Tony Benn. He has this quote, which is, "There's no final victory, just as there's no final defeat, just the same battle to be fought over and over again." And I think, you can think of that in like broad political terms as like, coming back to the same fight. But I think it also refers to this struggle that takes place within each of us, within our workplaces, within our communities every day, which is a struggle to believe that things could be different. I really, really do think that the biggest thing standing in the way of change is just the fact that most people don't think that they have any power and don't think that things could change. If that changed overnight, the whole system would basically lose legitimacy and would kind of crumble, right? Because once people stop believing in the system, the only power that those at the top can wield is just brute force and brute economic force, right? It's to kind of say, put down protests and...
But they do that already, right?
They do. But the fact that, we aren't pouring out onto the streets and that isn't the form of power that has to be used all the time suggests that there is this underlying legitimacy, or that people just simply don't think that change is possible, right? And that, I think, is the biggest barrier for economic and political transformation. It's just people blaming themselves for problems that are actually wider social problems, and people thinking of themselves as just these isolated individuals who could not possibly work alongside others to achieve change. And so in order to kind of push back against that shift, we do also need to move towards a different way of thinking about economics and politics that replaces individualism with collectivism, right? That says, rather than you just being responsible for everything that goes on in your own life, like, of course you are responsible for what happens in your own life, but also we as a collective are responsible for the nature of our society, for the outcomes that we see within our politics, for the way that our economy works. And if we begin to come together and really build different models within our communities, it starts to show people that there is an alternative. And that's really what's important. It's so many people know that this system is broken. They know that we're not fighting inequality, we're not fighting climate breakdown, but it's so hard to imagine how things could be different when you can only conceive of things from your perspective as this isolated individual.
And there's something you mentioned about kind of the way things are run, which you do talk about in the book a lot, which is when you become a minister of something, the handover or lack of handover from the previous minister. So when you became a minister for the first time, what did you get in terms of what had worked in the past, what hadn't worked?
There are no handovers. I mean, it's a completely amateur system. It's mad.
It did strike me as mad.
It's totally mad because they're not real jobs. But this has nothing to do with the Conservative Party or old Etonians. I mean, I think it's structure. You could be the most working class Labour minister in the world, and it's the same. It's a joke. These are not real jobs. These people who pretend to be ministers, it's largely about party management. The prime ministers run things from the centre. The people that they put into these cabinet positions are often there because they want to placate the left of their party or the right of their party, or this person is popular in the media, or this person's a threat. It would be like you trying to run a company, not actually asking who's the best person to run sales or marketing, but simply who's the most troublesome, difficult person in the organisation that I need to buy off by giving a top job.
You hear a lot people say, change the whole system. What does that mean in terms of taking the current system and changing it? What does that mean in practice?
Yeah, so I think sometimes people can feel a bit overwhelmed when people like me go, we can't just do one little policy over here. This requires kind of rethinking the system. What are we doing on work? What are we doing on wages? So it requires us to look across different points, work, education, taxes, green jobs, how the political system is working, and make some critical changes in all of those areas. And one thing that I say in the book, there is ways to bring that together. So something that has been used in other countries is a solidarity tax. So, and I really like it because of the wording, solidarity. And people don't often think of taxes as a way to build unity amongst groups. But it's something that's been used in different countries and at different points of crisis. And it's a way to say, look, we've got to tax the rich a bit more at this point, because we need to, in Germany's case, they were reunifying Germany. In this case, the next generation, unless we make huge investments at this point, are going to be in trouble. So how about a solidarity tax to the next generation?
This book is, of course, a lot about that kind of north-south divide. So can you explain what the Green Book is and how that perpetuates that divide?
Well, I took of a time when I was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and I had a kind of moment where I understood why we have a north-south divide, because the Green Book is what's used to test whether an investment should be made in some part of the country. So at the time, I was putting together the funding for Crossrail, which is now the Elizabeth line. And I was kind of putting this forward to be announced at the spending review in 2007. And I said to the civil servants of the Treasury, well, I can't do that without announcing anything in the north. You know, we can't just be all, you know, can I have a list of rail projects to announce alongside it? And I kept waiting and nothing came and nothing came back. I said to my private office, where is my list of projects I want to announce it alongside it was called Crossrail at the time. And one civil servant said, well, there isn't a list, Minister. Nothing passes the Green Book. I said, what do you mean? I said, the railways are falling to bits in the north of England. Oh, well, but the Green Book tests things on how much they will deliver back to the UK economy. And the rail projects in the north won't do that because the economy is not performing very well. And it was like a moment of like, oh my God, you know, really, I understand. It was like a moment, you know, when you just suddenly think, I understand now. I understand why everything gets sucked into London and the South East. It's the policy of the country. It's the policy of the Treasury. And that's what the Green Book does.
Politicians obviously don't know anything, really. They have to pretend to know things, because if you spend your time saying, I don't know, everyone's outraged.
Yeah.
But the truth is you can't know. They almost never put you running a department that you have any background in.
Why is that?
Well, it's partly that they're worried that if you've got a background in the subject, you're going to have a very kind of particular, weird, special interest in one niche. So they don't want to put a doctor into running the NHS because they're worried that they're going to think only about doctors. They're not going to understand nurses and ambulances and administration, all the other bits. But it's also that they want to control you. I think it's also deliberate. They don't want you to know too much, because if you know too much, you're a bit awkward.
What do you want the general public to take from this book? Maybe they can see a different way, but what happens then?
I think Steve said it before, politics is fixable. You can make it more functional. You know, we can't just always have this council of despair about politics, about it, oh, politicians are this or that. We say in the book, we know, because we work with them, the vast majority of good people, they're just working in a system that isn't right. And so it is fixable. And there's no point us all moaning about it all for ages and ages. We need a cross-party, cross-geography consensus about sensible rewiring of the British state to make it more functional and make it work better for all people in all places. It's not actually that complicated.
Mm. And so where's the hope? Where's the hope in from your experiences to going forward, and where's the hope in politics?
Well, I think one hope is that we're okay. I mean, society's okay. You know, you go outside and people are kind of getting on with their lives, and somehow, in many ways, London is fine. Well, it's really weird. I mean, you wouldn't have thought so, but that must be because the politicians are not really in charge. It doesn't really matter what's going on in Parliament.
Do you think sometimes you don't see the bits that aren't fine?
Well, I think there are lots of things that aren't fine.
Yeah.
Many, many things that aren't fine, and there are many things that are fine. I mean, I've spent a lot of my time working in places like Afghanistan. I can assure you that compared to Afghanistan, Britain's pretty fine. And compared to how Britain was 50 years ago, it's better. But, so I don't know how that happens. Given the mess and the madness, either sometimes the government's doing things which are not too bad, or maybe the government doesn't matter too much and society sort of gets on and solves a lot of its own problems.